The U.S. Army's tanks were dying without fuel, so a mechanic built a Lifeline Truck. August 1944. The Allied Army is racing across France so fast the maps can't keep up. General Patton's tanks are chewing up miles, but they're running on fumes. Behind the glory of the advance lies a terrifying truth. The Shermans are dying. Not from German shells, but from empty tanks. In the middle of this chaos, a grease-stained mechanic decides he's had enough of waiting for supply lines that never come. He's about to build something in a muddy field that will keep the steel monsters rolling. This is the story of the mechanic who built a lifeline when the world's greatest army was about to grind to a halt. Part 1. The Thirsty Beasts, the Fuel Crisis. To understand the genius of what was about to be built, you have to understand the math of 1944. And the math was terrifying. After the breakthrough at St. Lay during Operation Cobra, the Allied Army didn't just move, it exploded across the French countryside. General Patton's Third Army was covering 30, 40, sometimes 60 miles a day. It was the fastest blitzkrieg in history, but it had a fatal flaw. The M4 Sherman tank. It was the backbone of the American armored force. It was reliable, it was fast, and it was devastating. But it was also an alcoholic for gasoline. The average Sherman tank, powered by a massive Continental R975 radial engine, the kind used in airplanes, got about 0.6 miles to the gallon. Let that sink in. A Sherman didn't measure its efficiency in miles per gallon. It measured it in gallons per mile. To move a single tank just 100 miles, you needed over 150 gallons of high-octane fuel. Now multiply that by the hundreds of tanks in an armored division, plus the thousands of trucks, half-tracks, and jeeps. Every single day, Patton's Third Army was drinking nearly 400,000 gallons of gasoline. But the fuel wasn't the only problem. The problem was the delivery. In 1944, the U.S. Army relied on the jerry can, a 5-gallon steel container. To refuel one Sherman tank from empty, a crew had to manhandle 35 separate cans. Think about the physical toll, lifting a 40-pound metal can, unscrewing the cap, sticking in a funnel, and pouring it into the tank's fuel port. Now imagine doing that 35 times for every single tank in the middle of a muddy field, while German 88mm shells might start falling at any second. It was slow, it was exhausting, and in the heat of a high-speed pursuit, it was a death sentence for the momentum of the war. The supply lines were stretching to the breaking point. The gasoline was still sitting on the beaches of Normandy, nearly 300 miles behind the front. To get it to the tanks, the Army created the Red Ball Express, a massive fleet of trucks driving non-stop on one-way roads. But even the Red Ball Express was failing. Why? Because the trucks were so far from the base that they were burning half of their cargo just to make the trip to the front and back. By late August, the tanks began to sputter. Commands were coming down from the top. Keep moving. Don't let the Germans dig in. But you can't move steel without fire. Commanders were screaming over the radio for fuel, and all they were getting was, "Wait, the trucks are stuck. The cans are empty." Patton was furious. He famously said, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks gotta have gas." He was so desperate, he even ordered his men to liberate fuel from other units or capture German stockpiles, which were often useless because the Germans used low-grade diesel or synthetic fuel that would ruin a Sherman's engine. The tanks were becoming stationary bunkers. The greatest armored force in history was being defeated by a simple lack of liquid energy. In a repair depot behind the front lines, the mechanics saw the reality every day. They saw perfectly good tanks being abandoned on the side of the road because their needles hit. They saw crews exhausted from the jerry can shuffle. One of those mechanics, a man who spent his days covered in grease, and his nights listening to the distant rumble of a war that was passing him by, looked at the empty trucks and the thirsty tanks and had a thought. Why are we carrying fuel in cans? Why are we pouring it like it's 1918? He knew that if they didn't find a way to get fuel into those tanks faster, And while they were still moving, the liberation of Europe would stall right here in the mud. He didn't have a factory. He didn't have a blueprint from the Pentagon. All he had was a pile of scrap metal, a welding torch, and a desperate need to keep the steel monsters rolling. The era of the jerry can was about to end. The era of the lifeline was about to begin. Part 2. The Workshop in the Mud, the Unsung Hero. If you looked at a map of France in September 1944, you saw arrows of liberation sweeping toward the German border. But if you stood in a repair depot of the 3rd Armored Division, you saw a different story. You saw the backstage of war. The depot was a swamp of black oil and gray mud. The air was a constant roar of welding torches, clanging hammers, and the blue smoke of diesel engines being revived. In the middle of this chaos stood a man whose name wouldn't make the front pages, but whose hands were about to save an army. Let's call him Sarge. He was a technical sergeant, a man who had spent his pre-war life in a garage in Detroit or a machine shop in Pittsburgh. He didn't care about metals. He cared about torque, gaskets, and flow rates. And right now, Sarge was watching a scene that made his blood boil. A platoon of Sherman tanks had just rolled in, bone dry. The crews were exhausted, their faces blackened by cordite and grease. To get those tanks back into the fight, they were performing the jerry can shuffle. Dozens of men were hauling 5-gallon cans through the knee-deep mud, slipping, cursing, and spilling precious gasoline into the dirt. It took nearly an hour to refuel a single tank. "It's like trying to fill a bathtub with a thimble," Sarge muttered to his assistant, a young kid from Iowa who was busy scraping rust off a salvaged radiator. Sarge looked over at a pile of scrap metal in the corner of the depot. There lay the carcasses of deuce-and-a-half trucks that had hit landmines and a few massive fuel tanks salvaged from a destroyed German airfield. An idea, half crazy and entirely desperate, began to take shape in his mind. Why were they moving fuel in tiny cans? Why not move it in bulk? And more importantly, why were they pouring it by hand? In the civilian world, Sarge had seen fuel pumps at gas stations. He knew that a pump could move more liquid in a minute than a man could in an hour. But they didn't have gas stations in the Ardennes. They didn't have a supply chain for refueling tankers, because in 1944, the U.S. Army didn't officially think they needed them for the front lines. The planners thought the jerry cans were good enough. Sarge knew good enough was going to get a lot of Americans killed. He walked over to the captain in charge of the depot. "Sir," Sarge said, wiping his hands on a rag that was more oil than cloth. "Give me 2 days, a welding crew, and permission to strip those wrecked trucks. I'm going to build a monster." The captain looked at the mud, then at the empty tanks, and then at Sarge. "What kind of monster?" "A mobile lifeline, sir. A truck that can fill a Sherman in 5 minutes instead of 60. A truck that can refuel an entire platoon while the engines are still warm." The captain was skeptical. "Patton wants every spare part for repairs, Sarge. If you waste material on a science project and it fails, it's your neck." "It won't fail, sir," Sarge replied. "Because if it does, we're going to be walking to Berlin instead of riding." For the next 48 hours, Sarge and his crew became ghosts in the depot. They worked under the glow of hooded lanterns to hide from German night bombers. They cut, they welded, and they scavenged. They took the chassis of a heavy 2.5-ton GMC truck. They mounted 2 massive 600-gallon tanks onto the back, bracing them with salvaged steel girders from a bombed-out French bridge. But the heart of the machine was the magic trick. Sarge found a small gasoline-powered industrial pump from a captured German supply depot. With a bit of Yankee ingenuity, he rigged a series of long, heavy-duty hoses and nozzles, the kind used for aircraft. As the sun began to rise on the 3rd day, the monster was finished. It wasn't pretty. It was a Frankenstein's creature of olive-drab paint, rusted welds, and mismatched parts. It looked like something out of a nightmare, but to Sarge, it was beautiful. He climbed into the cab, fired up the engine, and drove it over to a thirsty Sherman tank that was about to head back to the front. The tank commander looked at the strange vehicle with a mix of confusion and hope. Sarge jumped out, hauled a thick hose over his shoulder, and climbed onto the back of the Sherman. He jammed the nozzle into the fuel port and signaled his assistant to kick the pump into gear. The pump roared to life. Instead of the slow, painful gluggle of a jerry can, the fuel surged into the tank with a powerful, steady hum. In less than 6 minutes, 150 gallons had been transferred. The tank commander stared at his fuel gauge in disbelief. "Sarge," he yelled over the engine noise, "you just saved us 2 hours of backbreaking labor." Sarge just nodded, already coiling the hose. "Don't thank me. Just go kill some tigers." But the real test was yet to come. It was one thing to refuel in a quiet depot. It was another to do it under the pressure of a lightning-fast offensive where every second was measured in lives. Sarge's Lifeline truck was about to head out into the chaos of the front lines, and the U.S. Army was about to learn that sometimes a thimble is no match for a fire hose. Part 3. The Invention, the Rolling Bomb. The Lifeline truck didn't just drive to the front. It hunted for the front. In the chaos of September 1944, there were no fixed lines. A German Panther tank could be hiding behind any hedgerow, and Allied planes, the Jabos, were so twitchy they sometimes strafed anything moved on the roads. For Sarge and his crew, driving a truck loaded with 1,200 gallons of high-octane gasoline was like sitting on a massive olive-drab firecracker. One tracer bullet, one stray piece of shrapnel, and they wouldn't just be dead, they'd be vaporized. But they didn't slow down. They couldn't. About 10 miles from the border of Luxembourg, Sarge found what he was looking for. A platoon of the 3rd Armored Division's Shermans stalled at a crossroads. The tanks were silent, their turrets traversed toward a dark tree line, but their engines were dead. They were sitting ducks. The platoon leader, a haggard lieutenant, ran up to the truck. "Sarge, tell me you've got more than just coffee in the back of that rig." "Better than coffee, Lieutenant," Sarge grinned, already jumping out of the cab. "I've got the blood of the 3rd Army." Sarge's crew didn't wait for orders. They had practiced this like a pit crew at an auto race. They pulled the heavy, reinforced hoses from the side of the truck. But Sarge had added one more field invention since they left the depot, a manifold system. Instead of refueling one tank at a time, he had rigged the pump to feed 4 separate hoses simultaneously. The scene was pure madness. 4 Shermans were clustered around the truck, their crews frantic. Usually, refueling was a silent, agonizing chore of lifting cans. Now, it was a roar of mechanical power. The German-made industrial pump hummed a deep, steady bass note, forcing gasoline through the lines at a rate the Army's manual said was impossible. In the time it normally took to open the lids of 30 jerry cans, Sarge had already filled the bellies of 2 Shermans. But the noise attracted attention. From the tree line, a German 88mm anti-tank gun opened up. Crack whiz, the shell slammed into a stone farmhouse 50 yards away, showering the refueling site with debris. "Keep pumping." Sarge roared, his hands steady on the manifold valves. "Sarge, we gotta go. That's an 88. His assistant yelled, eyes wide with terror as he looked at the 1,200 gallons of fuel they were standing next to. "Not until they're full." Sarge bellowed back. The tank crews, seeing the May mechanic standing his ground, didn't retreat. They worked faster. The moment a nozzle clicked shut, the tank commander slammed the hatch. The radial engine coughed into life with a cloud of blue smoke, and the Sherman roared forward to engage the German gun. One by one, the dead tanks came back to life. It was like watching a dying organism receive a massive shot of adrenaline. Within 15 minutes, not 2 hours, but 15 minutes, the entire platoon was combat ready and moving out to flank the German position. As the last tank rolled away, Sarge finally signaled his crew to reel in the hoses. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally hitting him. They scrambled back into the cab and floored it just as another 88mm shell cratered the exact spot where the truck had been standing seconds before. Word of the magic fuel truck began to spread like wildfire through the 3rd Armored. Commanders who had previously called it a science project were now calling headquarters, demanding to know why every battalion didn't have one. Sarge had proven that you didn't need a factory in Detroit to change the rules of engagement. You just needed a man who understood that in a war of machines, the most valuable weapon isn't the gun, it's the fuel line. The Germans were baffled. Their intelligence reports showed the Americans should be out of gas, stranded and vulnerable. Yet, the Shermans kept coming, appearing in places they shouldn't be, at speeds that defied their logistical maps. They didn't know about Sarge. They didn't know about the scrap metal monster that was turning the jerry can into a relic of the past. But Patton knew. And as the old blood and guts watched his tanks tear across the border, he knew his lifeline was no longer sitting on a beach in Normandy. It was right there in the mud, covered in grease and pumping the fire of victory. Part 4. Running on blood and gas, the impact of a revolution. Rumors in the Army travel faster than a P-51 Mustang, and the story of Sarge's Lifeline Truck was no exception. By mid-September 1944, the 3rd Armored Division, known as the Spearhead, was doing things that looked like magic on the maps of the Supreme Allied headquarters. While other divisions were stalling, their commanders pleading for more jerry cans, the 3rd Armored was moving like a scythe through the German lines. The secret wasn't just the bravery of the tankers. It was the grease-covered mechanics who were now building Sarge's monsters in every repair depot they could set up. The Invention had evolved. What started as one scrap metal truck had become a small fleet of mobile refueling units. They were the ghosts that haunted the tail of every tank column. General George S. Patton, a man who measured a commander's worth by the mileage on his tank's odometers, began to notice. He saw the reports from the 3rd Armored. He saw that they were refueling in 20 minutes what took his own divisions 3 hours. Legend has it that when Patton first saw one of these rigged-up trucks in action, he didn't criticize the lack of official Army regulation paint or the mismatched German parts. He simply looked at the fuel gauge of a Sherman being filled and barked, "I want one of those behind every goddamn tank in the 3rd Army." But the most profound impact wasn't on the American side. It was the psychological collapse of the German High Command. German intelligence, led by General Reinhard Gehlen, was built on cold, hard logic. They knew the Americans were hundreds of miles from their ports. They knew the Red Ball Express was struggling. According to German logistical manuals, Patton should have run out of gas at the Moselle River. They had planned their counterattacks based on the forced pause of the American armor. They expected the Shermans to stop. They expected the crews to spend half a day hauling cans. They expected a window of opportunity to strike. But the pause never came. A German Oberst, colonel, captured near the Siegfried Line later told his interrogators, "We didn't understand. We saw your tanks run all day, and we thought, surely, tonight they must stop to refuel. We moved our anti-tank guns into position under the cover of darkness, expecting a static target. But by midnight, your tanks were already 10 miles behind us. We weren't being outfought. We were being outrun by a ghost supply line." The Lifeline Truck had eliminated the logistical friction of war. It allowed for the creation of the rolling refuel. Instead of pulling the tanks back to a safe rear area, the trucks would meet the tanks just behind the crest of a hill or in a captured village. The engines would stay hot, the crews would stay in their seats, and the momentum of the blitzkrieg in reverse stayed relentless. Sarge and his mechanics were now the most hunted men in France. German snipers and werewolf units were ordered to ignore the tanks and target the trucks with the long hoses. The Germans realized, too late, that if you kill the fuel, you kill the monster. But Sarge had an answer for that too. He began welding salvaged armor plates from destroyed Panzer IVs onto the sides of his fuel trucks. He mounted .50 caliber machine guns on the cabs. His Lifeline trucks were becoming war wagons. The atmosphere in the American camps shifted from desperation to a grim, oily confidence. The tankers no longer looked at their fuel needles with the fear of a man watching his life ebb away. They looked at the horizon, knowing that somewhere in the dust behind them, Sarge was coming. They weren't just running on gasoline anymore. They were running on the sheer stubborn ingenuity of men who refused to let a lack of supplies stop the march to Berlin. As the first autumn rains began to turn the French soil into a thick, soul-sucking paste, the fuel crisis of 1944 reached its climax. The Great Gas Famine was hitting the Allied armies hard. Montgomery in the north was stopped. Bradley in the center was slowing down. But the Spearhead and Patton's favorites kept their engines roaring. The Lifeline Truck had become more than a tool. It was a symbol of the American way of war, a war where a mechanic's welding torch could be just as decisive as a general's stars. But as they approached the border of the German Reich, the stakes were about to get even higher. The supply lines were now stretched like a piano wire about to snap. The Red Ball Express was exhausted. And Sarge was about to face his greatest challenge: how to keep 1,000 tanks moving when the nearest gallon of gas was a world away, and the enemy was finally fighting on their own doorstep. The fire of victory needed more fuel, and Sarge was running out of scrap metal. Part 5. Victory through Greece, the legacy of the Lifeline. When the guns finally fell silent across Europe in May 1945, the victory parades were filled with the roar of Sherman tanks and the cheering of millions. The history books began to be written, filled with the names of Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton. But if you looked closely at the edges of those photos, tucked behind the rows of armor, you'd see them, the battered, armored-up, oil-stained Lifeline trucks. They were the skeletons of the victory, the mechanical backbone that had allowed the Spearhead to reach the heart of Germany before the enemy could even blink. After the war, the Pentagon conducted an exhaustive analysis of why the Allied advance had succeeded where others had failed. They looked at the 3rd Armored Division's performance and were stunned. The speed they maintained wasn't just a matter of spirit or bravery, it was a matter of flow rates. They realized that the Sarge's monsters, built in the mud of France, had done more to defeat the German panzers than many new tank designs ever could. The era of the jerry can as the primary fuel source for an armored army was officially over. The U.S. Army took the blueprints, the messy, hand-drawn sketches Sarge had made on the back of key ration boxes, and turned them into a standard. Today, if you look at a modern M1 Abrams tank, it's refueled by massive, high-pressure, heavy expanded mobility tactical trucks, HEMTT. They are the direct descendants of a scrap metal monster built in 1944. But what about Sarge? He didn't receive a Medal of Honor. There are no statues of a man with a welding torch in the center of Washington, D.C. Like millions of other greatest generation soldiers, Sarge went home. He traded his olive drab fatigues for a clean pair of coveralls, and probably went back to his garage in Detroit or his farm in Iowa. He spent the rest of his life fixing tractors or tuning up family cars, likely never telling his neighbors that he was the man who kept Patton's army from grinding to a halt. He was the invisible hero, and that's the point. History often forgets the oil, but it always remembers the blood. We talk about the longest day and the Battle of the Bulge, but we rarely talk about the greatest logistical miracle. Sarge's story is a reminder that in the face of impossible odds, the most powerful tool isn't always a gun. Sometimes it's a wrench. Sometimes it's the refusal to accept good enough when people's lives are on the line. The lesson of the Lifeline Truck is simple. Strategy is for the dreamers, but logistics is for the winners. You can have the best tanks in the world and the bravest men in history, but if you can't feed the machine will fail you. So the next time you see a photo of a Sherman tank charging across a bridge in Germany, don't just look at the 75mm gun or the white star on the turret. Look at the ground behind it. Look at the fuel cap. And think of a man in a muddy field with a welding torch who saw a problem and refused to wait for a miracle. Because in 1944, Sarge didn't just build a truck. He built the lifeline that carried the world toward freedom, 1 gallon at a time. And for the Third Army, that was the difference between a war that dragged on for years and a victory that changed history.